Hola mi gente, ¿cómo están? Aquí Alba Mar, me pueden decir Alba. El canal es Celiela y vamos a hablar de libros y algunos de ellos en español desde Puerto Rico. Hi people, my name is Alba Mar, you may call me Alba. The channel is Celiela and we're here to talk about books and some of them in Spanish from Puerto Rico. So let's get started. I'm putting the timer on because it's very hot here. I've had air conditioning problems, so I want to do this fast for me and for you. So the first book that I finished reading was The Apartment in Bab El-Louk, which was the prompt, I think, for a graphic novel. And this is my first graphic novel that takes place in the Middle East. And this was such an interesting read, so different for me, that I had to read it twice. It's about an elderly man, I think. Anyway, a man who lives in an apartment in Bab El-Louk in Egypt. And apparently on one of the upper floors. And basically it's his observations and what he listens to and what he sees from the window in his apartment. Some of what he observes from his window is political. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I went back and read it twice. From inside the apartment in Bab El-Louk, you excel in the art of snooping. Those of us who have lived in cities know that feeling. And this is where the illustrator changes and the art changes. And I'll leave it at that. Very thought-provoking book, and I just want to recommend Jen at Remembered Reads. She reviewed this book, and I think she did a phenomenal job on it. So yeah, and this also was what we were going to read for Reading Around the World. So yeah, I enjoyed it, and I'm probably going to read it again because, you know, I identify people of a certain age who live alone in an apartment. Yeah. And the things we observe from that apartment. Yeah, that's happened. And then after that, I read and finished in Spanish. This is a combination of Spanish and English. La gran muralla de la ciudad, corazón. It's a collection of stories by Maricel Jimenez Peña. The first stories, I think there are 5 stories. The first 4 stories are in Spanish, beginning with the title, the story of the title of the collection, La gran muralla de la ciudad, corazón, which is like an allegory taking place in Puerto Rico, because you can tell that the setting is in Puerto Rico. But there's this grand wall. That's what the gran muralla is, a grand wall. And people who can scale that enormous wall or burrow under it or somehow get across the wall and be kissed by the princess or the young lady behind the wall will achieve, let me see what they're going to achieve, long life or something like that. You know, one of those things that immortality and eternal happiness. So yeah, and I enjoyed the first story. The atmosphere was definitely Puerto Rican countryside, and it was a quest, and he had to overcome a lot of obstacles. And it takes a little twist at the end, which was very interesting. But what my favorite story was, the one in English, which is called The Plebiscite. And it's about this. She wrote this story, the plebiscite, for a writer's workshop that she was taking at the Mayagüez branch of the University of Puerto Rico, one of those writer's workshops. And yeah, this was a plebiscite that took place in 1998, I think 5 months after another hurricane, devastating hurricane, that was George at the time. And despite the destruction and despite everything that occurred, and the privations and that life, you know, is suspended after a hurricane for a while. The governor at that time, Pedro Rosselló, decided to go ahead with the plebiscite anyway. And it's basically the observations that the younger version of Maricel, who was at the university at that time, Maricel Jimenez, her observations of the people that were discussing the pros and cons of the plebiscite and how they were going to vote. At the end of it, she writes an epilogue, and it says, Note 1, I finished this story in 1998 before the actual elections took place. The final choice of the Puerto Rican people was number 5, none of the above. It was independence, statehood, to remain the same, free associated state, and none of the above. And the choice in 1998 was none of the above. And to this day, 2018, which was when this book came out, the colonial status of Puerto Rico remains unresolved. Note number 2. On September 20th of 2017, Puerto Rico was hit by a Category 5 hurricane named Maria. Curiously enough, the governor of the island this time around was Pedro Rosselló's, that other governor, son, Ricardo Rosselló. Yeah, because we now have our own dynasties. And during the summer of 2017, Ricardo Rosselló held a plebiscite in which most of the island abstained, which is true. Most of the island did not vote in that plebiscite. And statehood won. 6 months after Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico was hit by tidal waves from a cold front that brought 30-foot waves and destroyed coastlines. I can't help but notice the parallelisms, paralelismo in Spanish. Prophecy, she asks herself. Well, no, not prophecy, but after reading a few more books on Puerto Rican history, it seems to me that we haven't learned our lessons. So yeah, that was fascinating reading. So then, the other one that I finished reading was Sambirón. Oh, the next one was Jenny Lawson. Here it is. Jenny Lawson, I'm going to put it up here. That I read in audiobook. It's a reread for me. That was for the mental health prompt. And the audio book edition added a little punch to my rereading because Jenny Lawson sings in her fashion. She sings at the beginning of each chapter, and there are also sound effects. So it was very entertaining, but at the same time, very moving. She does have, makes a lot of funny observations and whimsical observations, unique observations about anxiety. And she suffers from anxiety, but she also paints a very moving picture about anxiety, especially when she talks about her daughter and the birth of her daughter and what that meant to her as someone who was suffering from anxiety. So yeah, I really enjoyed that reread of Jenny Lawson. Next, all during the month, I read Sambirón with Lisbeth. Lisbeth is someone who comments in the comment section of this channel, and she's a Puerto Rican young woman who lives in Europe. And I don't know her, but I had a wonderful time, a great experience, buddy reading this with her in Spanish. Sambirón was for the rural prompt, and this takes place in 19th century Puerto Rico in the countryside, starting around 1820, around there, 1830s, and proceeds until almost 1990. And it's a family saga, which I had to stop reading because I was getting it confused with Cien Años de Soledad. For me, this was more a plot-driven book than a character-driven book. I didn't feel especially drawn to any of the characters. To me, they represented certain sectors of our society, especially at that time in the country. Now, this book was first published in 1998, and since then it's had like 5 reprintings. And so this is a popular book, and I can understand why. Because she mastered the whole process of not only growing coffee, cultivating coffee in the mountains of Puerto Rico, but also every other aspect of agricultural life in Puerto Rico. And in the family, you have your matriarch and, you know, the hardworking, sacrificial mom, and then you have the hardworking dad and the different neighbors. And throughout the whole novel, what she really captures is the moving of the population. How the Puerto Rican population was slowly abandoning and being moved out of the countryside and into urban areas or outside the country. Yeah, and this was a recurring theme, and I'm glad she brought it up and she emphasized it, because that's why our diaspora is double the population that we have on the island. And she depicts that to a T perfectly. Now, there's a little glitch for me in that she jumps the whole crucial period of light industrialization that occurred here in Puerto Rico, the 1950s. She jumped that whole decade of 1950, 1960s, 1970s. And she comes back to the family with the granddaughter. The granddaughter already older and married. So yeah, but it was still an interesting plot because it was an engaging story. So that was Sambirón by Tina Casanova, and I think she has 2 more in this series about the family, and I hope to read it someday. I tried to read snippets from A Native Daughter, and I started by Haunani K. Trask. This will probably be rolled over to this month, July. And I'm still rereading La Mordaza, which is very important, especially for July. And I also made a dent, more of a dent, into dying to better themselves, West Indians and the building of the Panama Canal. I read about the construction of the railroad, and that came first. And I'm right smack dab in the middle of the French attempt at making a Panama Canal. And the factors behind Jamaican immigration to Panama and the conflicts, the political conflicts in Colombia, for which Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel Garcia Marquez came in very handy. I could recognize the conflict from a mile away thanks to 100 Years of Solitude. So yeah, this is something that I will continue to read from the perspective of the West Indian workers who constructed the Panama Canal, along with other indentured people. And I finished with my bingo, Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches by Audre Lorde. That was for my LGBTQ plus. This really got me in the heart, in the feels, like people say. And everything about it. I loved Poetry is Not a Luxury. I have it all here tabbed. Poetry is Not a Luxury. I haven't been highlighting a lot, but this I had to highlight. Poetry as a revelatory distillation of experience is not sterile wordplay. For women, poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within, which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives. And I'm not a poetry person, but that was beautiful. That was beautiful. And then she has one that's called The Transformation of Silence into Language. What is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. And there's so many nuggets here. Beautiful, beautiful thoughts. Oh, this one. Poetry doesn't sell Cadillacs. Tell me about it. And she has an interview with Adrienne Rich, in which she's talking about how one of her poems was came from her rage at the acquittal of a white policeman who had shot a black child in 1979. Essay about the uses of anger, women responding to racism, where she speaks about anger and what anger can do constructively. She says here in another essay called Eye to Eye, anger used does not destroy, hatred does. It is easier to be angry than to hurt. Anger is what I do best. It's easier to be furious than to be yearning. Yeah, boy. But this is the part that really got to me. Grenada Revisited, an interim report. This is her second trip to Grenada in 1983 after United States invaded the country, because Grenada is where her family was from, especially her mom. That's what her mom considered. Grenada was considered her home. And yeah, I won't say any more because it's very hot and I have no air conditioning, but this is worthwhile reading, especially if you're Puerto Rican. Grab a book, grab this, Sister Outsider, and read that last essay on Grenada. Yeah, so let me show you my bingo. My bingo is done. There we go. Diagonal, rural setting, Sambirón. LGBTQ plus, Sister Outsider. My free space, I talked about my free space to you before. Mental health, Jenny Lawson. And YA, the Poet X. So, there we go, people. Up to here, it's very hot. I hope you're keeping cool, and I hope you're doing well. Thanks for visiting. I'll see you soon. Cuídense mucho. Adiós.